Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Centre for Food Policy's January, Veganuary Food Thinkers. These are, as many of you know, regular sessions where we invite speakers from the world of food to give a presentation and then join us for a discussion afterwards. I'm Lindy Sharp, and I'm the Director of the Food Research Collaboration here at the Centre for Food Policy at City. I have some announcements to make before our presentation begins. First of all, if you would like to stay in touch with us to receive our monthly newsletters, either the Centre for Food Policy or the Food Research Collaborations, and get our event updates, could you please put your email in the Q&A box, because the chat is disabled. This box is filtered by us, so your details will not be shared with the public. That way, if you can specify which newsletter you want, we can sign you up. I can also tell you that applications are now open for both the Masters in Food Policy at the Centre and the new BSc in Nutrition and Food Policy, which is a very exciting course. And you can find details of both those programs on the City website. I also would like to point out that we at the Food Research Collaboration are looking for a brilliant new research assistant to replace our irreplaceable previous research assistant to work with us from now till October. So either get in touch with me or look at the City website for the details of that vacancy. And I also need to remind you that this webinar is being recorded and eventually will be made available afterwards via our YouTube channel. We of course hope that you'll have lots of comments and questions this evening, and we would ask you to put these in the Q&A box as the talk proceeds, not the chat box. We will take questions after the presentation, and they kind of accumulate as they go along, so don't worry if it looks as if nobody else is asking questions. Just ask your question and we will try to get through as many as possible. And if you'd like to tweet, please do, using the hashtag Food Thinkers and the handles at Food Policy City and at Pasture for Life. So now to the business of the evening. It is my great pleasure to introduce this month's speaker, Fidelity Weston. Fidelity is a farmer, and she's also a powerful advocate for a particular kind of livestock farming in which ruminant animals are fed only, surprise, surprise, grass. She manages a family's farm in Kent, 200 acres in the southeast part of England, and the farm is certified organic with the Soil Association, but it's also certified Pasture for Life, different thing, which is what she's going to be talking about this evening. She farms cattle and sheep, and improving the farm for nature is central to her approach. But Fidelity is also vice president of the Pasture Fed Livestock Association, which is a membership organization of mainly farmers, but also academics, butchers, restaurateurs, vets, others who support the benefits to the environment, to animal welfare, and to human health of raising ruminants, that is to say cattle and sheep mainly, entirely from pasture. And she's also chair of CLEAR, that's the Consortium for Labelling for the Environment, Animal Welfare and Regenerative Farming. This is a growing group of, I think, 40 food farming and civil society organizations, which is campaigning for mandatory, clear and honest method of production labeling. It's very important. We've got lots of other information on food labels. It's hard to find out how food is produced. So that's a new campaign. We also have in the audience, but unable to speak and answer questions, Bill Grayson. Bill is also a member of the Pasture Fed Livestock Association, and I know from having spoken to him in the past that he's probably one of the most knowledgeable graziers in the country. A grazier is an expert on grazing, which is both what animals do when they eat grass, but it's also a type of land, grazing land, mainly grass, though as Bill will say, not only grass. And Bill is in fact a conservation grazier in the northwest of England, and the Graysons graze their livestock on a scattering of sites, mostly owned by conservation bodies, and the grazing is specifically managed to benefit the conservation needs of each of these sites. So the numbers and the type of the livestock and the timing of the grazing is all managed to achieve the required impacts from the behaviors of the animals, not just from eating, but from trampling, browsing and dunging, all of which contribute to a type of landscape and a type of ecosystem that is very characteristic of parts of Britain. Finally, why talk meat this month? Well, because it's Veganuary. And Veganuary is an annual challenge run by a UK non-profit that promotes and educates about veganism, which is the avoidance of all animal products. And it does this by encouraging people to follow a vegan lifestyle the month of January. It began in 2014. Participation's increased each year. It has a lot of media attention. And last year, more than 500,000 people took part all over the world, not just here. So, as we all know, these things are complicated, and Fidelity will make the case this evening that veganism, laudable as it is, various reasons, may involve throwing out the baby with the bathwater. Fidelity, I'd like to hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Lindy, and thank you for that very full introduction. It's going to save me having to say quite a lot about myself. So I can get going on the talk straight away. I'd just like to say to the audience, it's really great that you're all there. I have to say, I personally find it quite weird to be talking to people I can't see and just looking at my computer screen. So you'll have to excuse the presentation. There'll probably be lots of glitches and everything else. But what I want to do tonight is to share my screen. Hopefully that you can all see that now, can you? Yeah. So my plan tonight is to tell you a little bit more about myself and in particular the way we farm here in Kent. We're just south of Sevenoaks. I'm then going to go on and answer the question that I think Lindy asked me to answer, which is, what does it feel like being a beef farmer in Veganuary? So I'm going to touch on that and some of the bigger issues. I'm then going to go on and tell you much more about the Pasture-Fed Livestock Association, how we as a group of farmers farm, and how I believe, well, we all believe that really this is the future for farming, and actually it's at the heart of the future of the planet as well. And then finally, I want to just tell you more about our campaign for clear labelling. Some of you might have been, if you're Radio 4 listeners, and especially if you're Farming Today listeners, you'll realise that this week, Farming Today are having a complete concentration on labelling. And today I was also interviewed by you and yours. So labelling is the thing to be talking about this week. So it's very appropriate. So this is a view standing on the Green Sand Ridge, which is just south of Sevenoaks, overlooking our farm. We live in what I would think is a beautiful part of the country. It's undulating hills. It's very wooded with large woods at the top of the hill, and you're looking out here across to the Weald of Kent. The Green Sand Ridge itself is geologically a very interesting area. There's two types of clay that come up onto the green sand, and they slump in different ways with the weather. So it's constantly undulating, and you can see there the cattle grazing this undulating land. We've got small fields with very good hedgerows. And I would say that as a landscape, it's just made for grazing animals. It's not good enough to grow cereals. As I say, we've got plenty of woodlands in the area, and I think really the best use of this landscape is on grazing animals. Just trying to work out how to move on to my talk. Hold on. There we go. This is our suckler herd of roundabout, that fluctuates between sort of 22 and 25 cows. So a suckler herd basically is a beef herd. It means that you have cows and heifers that are having calves, and the business is rearing the calves and selling them either as meat or back into other people's breeding flock herds or ours. We try to keep our cattle out all the year round if we can. The youngsters are out all the year, and that's partly thanks to the Green Sand Ridge, which is dry, and we can put them up there over the winter. And the cows come into the barn for a period over the winter. We're trying to manage our grazing, as I'll tell you later on, in a way that means that we can increase the time they're outside, which is very good for the land, it's good for biodiversity, and decrease the time they're in the barns. This photograph in particular sort of really shows the landscape around us, and it's more or less exactly the same as it was. We've got a map of 1655 of the farm, and the field boundaries are almost identical. and many of the field names that we use today have Anglo-Saxon roots to them. Our neighbour just over the hedge from us has got a Bronze Age settlement there, remains of one. So this is a landscape that has really been created through ruminant livestock, grazing, year in, year out. And I like to feel that we're just continuing with something that's been going on here for many, many years. I should just explain the term ruminant. That is, ruminants are basically cattle, sheep and goats, and they're animals that have a unique ability to eat grass and convert it into protein for humans to eat. There's no other animal, humans certainly can't, and monogastrics, which are poultry and pigs, also can't effectively convert grass into protein and utilize it in such a brilliant way. I think the other point I want to make is Lindy mentioned about grass. We like to refer to this as pasture because one of the things that we're aiming for is a real diverse of plants in our fields. So that includes, of course, grass and many different types of grasses, but also many other wildflowers and clovers, vetches and trefoils. So those are our cattle. That photograph was probably taken in May last year when we're still in the middle of calving. These are some of our youngsters. This little group here are typical of what we do over the winter, which is that we feed them outside, and if the fields are dry enough, we're very keen on feeding our own species-rich homegrown hay to our animals, and in doing that, we're moving seed around the farm. So we're using it as a way of putting them onto poorer fields. They eat the hay over the winter, they poo it out and trample it down, and this all adds to increasing the diversity of our swards. So as Lindy said, we're very keen on the wildlife on our farm. And if we didn't have cattle and sheep grazing in this way, we would not have the wildlife that we have now, and especially not have the ability to so simply just improve it through no mechanical means, just by grazing livestock. Apart from the beef cattle, we also have a flock of round about 150 clean ewes. It's a commercial flock, but they're a hardy small breed that don't need a lot of input. And they, as with our cows, are fed, kept on a regime that means they're not fed any cereals. This little bunch of sheep here are lambs. They were born in March and April last year, so 2021. They're the lucky ones that didn't make it to the slaughterhouse within the usual time. Most lambs are usually ready to go at around about 6 months. Because we're pasture fed and we don't feed any cereals to push them along or help finish them off, these are ones that didn't make the mark by around about Christmas. At that time, the nutrients have gone off the grass. They stopped continuing to grow and get fat. So we run them up the hill. We graze lots of our neighbours' land. We keep them on through the winter, and then we finish them, which means taking them through until they are ready to go on our lovely species-rich spring grasses as they come through in April and May. We sell that as hogget, which is year-old lamb, and if you like eating meat, very tasty and extremely full of nutrients, as I'll be talking about later on. There again, the sheep are kept outside all year round. They're never brought in, and we lamb outside. If the weather's terrible, we might have to bring them in, but most of the time, a sensible ewe, with a bit of help with small bales put out in the field to provide shelter, can perfectly happily lamb outside. It means that there's very little intervention from humans. The lambs are literally born, they get up, they start sucking from their mums. We might catch them once to mark them up so we know which lambs belong to which ewes, and then off they go. So they have a very natural, extremely high welfare life for the time that they're alive. So that's our farm, and just before I move on, I want to tell you a bit more about the Pasture Fed Livestock Association. As Lindy said, we're certified organic with the Soil Association, and we converted to organic in 2020. I should have said that we've been here we're in our 38th year of farming at this farm. So we moved here in 1984, and they didn't convert to organic until 2020, and I'll tell you a little bit more about the implications of that later on. I'm also certified with the Pasture Fed Livestock Association, and our certification scheme is Pasture for Life, which is audited as an organic scheme is, and basically it's proof to the purchaser that our meat really is genuinely 100% pasture fed. The Pasture Fed Livestock Association is the most brilliant community of innovative and go-ahead farmers. There's 750 members, and I think about 700 are farmers. The remaining membership are, as Lindsay said, academics, restaurateurs, butchers, people who just want to support the promoting the growing of ruminants, which I remind you all is cattle and sheep, entirely from pastures. It's not just pasture, permanent pasture, as you might think of it, but also very, very importantly, on forage crops that are put into arable rotation. And again, I'll be talking about that much later on. So the PFLA is very active, with highly dependent on volunteers. So I'm a volunteer. I was director for 7 years and chairman for quite a lot of that time. Bill Grayson, who Lindy introduced you to, is an incredible contributor of his volunteer time. He's a member of our research group, which we're really proud of. The research group is a group of farmers, including Bill and others, who are particularly good on research, maybe have academic backgrounds. And we've got a wonderful model where they make their contribution and we pay a facilitator to make things happen. And the aim of that group is to really get involved in research that is looking into how on the ground, out there in real life, ruminant animals can contribute to all the things that we all around this table or in this room looking at this computer care about, which is the future of the planet, the environment, and our own health. So we've forged links with academic institutions and we've influenced research, and our farmers are brilliant at participating in research as well. So we're a very collaborative bunch of people, and one of the aims is to grow the supply chains, which we're becoming successful at doing, starting at a regional level. And here in this photograph, you can see our members selling from their own shops, but also working together to supply local butchers and things. So it's a very good organisation to support. Membership is £100, by the way. So we all agree that our food production needs to change. I just want to start by saying a few figures which I just find are quite shocking, really. 26% of greenhouse gas emissions come from food production, and that includes farming. 70% of drinking water is drawn for agriculture and food production. 1/3 of the Earth's soil is no longer productive. Hunger and malnutrition remains the biggest killer in the world today, causing 30,000 deaths a day. And globally, about 30% of pregnant women are suffering from anemia because of a lack of iron in their diet, something that would most easily be remedied if they had more red meat. We clearly do need to do something about our food system, and there is so much that farming can do to change and contribute to a better system. But is the solution in stop eating meat? I don't think so. And indeed, I believe, as Lindy said, if we went down that route, we would be throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So I'll be telling you during this talk and later on about how we as a society need to understand that it's not about the cow, but the how. And that's crucial to this discussion. How do we rear our animals? How do we grow our vegetables? How do we grow our cereals? And the hard bit has to be that it is to do with regeneration. So I would advocate for Regenerative rather than Veganuary. So during Veganuary, how do I feel about this? Well, one of the things that we frequently hear is the statement that the single most important thing we can all do is stop eating meat. And when I hear that, I think about the fact that cattle numbers have actually stayed roughly the same in the UK since the 1950s, but air and road transport was just 4% then of what it is now. So if we look at these figures here, which are from the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, it's their 2021 report into the final greenhouse gas emissions 2019. You will see from here that greenhouse gas emissions 27% of net greenhouse gas emissions were estimated to be from the transport sector, 21% from the energy supply, 17% from business, 15% from the residential sector, and 10% from agriculture. All of the transport sector emissions are carbon dioxide. These are emissions that just keep on coming, and they stay in the atmosphere for hundreds of years. The 10% of emissions from agriculture include just over 50% of which are methane, and nitrous oxides giving 32%. So the carbon dioxide addition is actually a smaller proportion of the gases. I'm going to go on and talk about the nitrous oxide particularly a bit later on and in more detail, and the methane. But those figures make me ask, why do we focus so much on the eating of meat? My personal view is that it's partly that we're living in the shadow of a report that was written by the UN in 2006 called Livestock's Long Shadow. And in that, they claim that the greenhouse emissions from livestock were more than the greenhouse emissions from all transport put together. This was based on an entirely flawed analysis, and it wasn't until 12 years later in 2018 that livestock experts, also from the UN, really brought out the fact that the way this had been portrayed was based so flawed that basically they had accounted for just the direct emissions of transport and the whole life cycle emissions of livestock, two totally incomparable ways of assessing emissions. They went on to say that there is no life cycle figure for transport. And so if you take direct emissions from both transport and livestock, the figures are 14% and 5% respectively. And it's estimated, but not known, that transport life cycle emissions are at least 1.5 times direct ones, so that we can't compare the two. They go on and warn that negative press about livestock may influence development plans and investments and further increase food insecurity. And they are talking there about a global level. So this, I think these figures are stuck in people's minds, and it's as though we're in a mindset that is starting from the basis that livestock must be bad. I think we should also realise that this is such a new area of science, and there's so much more to learn, and we need to be flexible and sympathetic in our approach to these things. So one of the recent things that's come up is how the way methane has been measured is possibly also a flawed approach. And climate scientists are highlighting this in a big way now, so that Professor Dave Frame said that the GWP model, 100 model, which is the current model for analysing methane, uses a one-size-fits-all to approach to determine the warming effect of different climate gases. But yet, in fact, different gases have very different warming effects. So as Professor Miles Allen from the Oxford Martin School at Oxford University explains, there are two distinct types of emissions. There are the long-lived pollutants, like carbon dioxide, which persist in the atmosphere and build up over centuries. So that, for instance, the carbon dioxide that was created in the 1800s by burning coal is still affecting the climate today. And then there are those short-lived pollutants, like methane, which disappear within about 10 years. Their effect on climate is undoubtedly important, but it is very different from that of CO2. And he goes on to explain that the GWP 100 method of measurement understates the warming impact of new methane sources by a factor of 4 over the first 20 years after the increase, and overstates the warming impact of constant methane by a factor of 4. As it is, livestock numbers are roughly the same and haven't changed for many years. So they are a constant source of methane, and the effect of their warming should not be counted as high as it is at the moment. So he goes on to say that really Europe needs to decide on how they're going to calculate their methane emissions, and warns that achieving climate neutrality in terms of metric equivalent emissions could mean eliminating practices such as ruminant agriculture that are not actually causing global warming. Dr. Frank Nicolona from the University of California, Davis, has said he sees methane as a flow gas which cycles through the atmosphere, and that GWP 100 approach incorrectly treats it as a stop gas which accumulates in the atmosphere. So it's really important that we start to understand these gases and acknowledge any changes that might take place and how that might filter through to policy. There is another quick area of interest that I think I would just mention at this point, and that is there is research beginning to show that within the soil there's methane removing bacteria called methanotropes, and it's thought that the work of these bacteria could be very crucial and very interesting. It's understood that their ability to work is seriously inhibited with the use of fertilizers, and I'll be talking about how I think the importance of reducing fertilizers is absolutely vital in this whole discussion. It was also interesting to see that there was a piece of research when they were scoping out sources of methane when they were trying to do a benchmarking for a fracking operation was going to take place. And this study showed that there were plumes of methane that come out from old landfill sites and leaking gas pipes. And the only identified agricultural sources of methane were from cattle sheds and manure heaps, where the methane is being generated well away from pastures, which might otherwise be able to absorb it. So these are sorts of research that the PFLA would be organisations that we'd most definitely be interested in getting involved in. There's one final area that I feel that always hits me in the face again during Veganuary, because again, I'm thinking, why are we focusing on meat? And that is the business about rubbish. Veganuary is really a month when we're perhaps thinking about actions that we can all take as individuals to improve the climate. But I often wonder why there is so little advocacy on the need to reduce our waste. It's something that every single one of us can so easily do. Nearly all emissions from waste are methane, and they're absolutely not contributing any good at all. I was reading a Waitrose magazine the other day, and that's why I pulled this slide together. Basically, here are some more figures. 26% of greenhouse gas emissions come from food production, as I've already said. 25% of those are caused by waste. The article went on to say that the UK wastes 3.1 million glasses of milk a day. That's around 1.3 million pints. It takes 358 million cubic meters of water and 77,000 acres of land to produce that wasted milk. And if we used every crop, it would do the same for climate change as planting 5.9 million trees. There's rather a lot of figures there, but somehow it paints a picture to me that we should just buy less. We certainly shouldn't waste anything. There's easy wins in reducing methane emissions, and those are emissions that are doing absolutely no good whatsoever. I was also told the other day that we apparently in the UK throw away 34,000 tonnes of beef and lamb every year. Such a waste, and all we're doing is putting gases up into the air. So when I read all these things, I just think, why don't we hear in January about reducing travel, consuming less, wasting less, avoiding foods that rely on chemicals at the expense of regeneration for their production? The cynic would say it's because our economic system relies on us continuing to do all of those things. The economy would survive intact without eating meat. So finally, before looking at some of the nice things about pasture-fed livestock, I just wanted to put this is the slide that was pulled together by one of my colleagues, and it's the one that the PFLA uses to promote all the reasons as to why we believe you should eat beef and lamb that's reared from pasture and not beef and lamb that is based on the grain-fed system. So on the right-hand side, you can see here that producing grain relies on fossil fuels, often forest clearance, wetland drainage, ploughing, nitrate fertilizers, all things that are very damaging to the environment and the operation of the soils. On the left-hand side, you can see ruminants who are grazing what is actually leftover land as far as human consumption is concerned. 60% of the world and 60% of the UK are covered in grass, So why not use that to graze your ruminants on? Another little figure is that it takes 7 kilos of cereals to produce 1 kilo of beef, and 30% of the world's production of grain is fed to animals. So it seems very wasteful to be doing that, and certainly not environmentally sensible. Interestingly, in 2013, the Food and Agricultural Organization at the UN produced a report which showed how if we stopped feeding all animals with grains, we could feed the growing population of the world with organic farming methods. This report was mirrored 5 years later in 2018 by a similar one done by Europe's Institute for Sustainable Development and International Relations, which showed exactly the same with regard to Europe. You should note that it does say stopping feeding all animals with grains, and the reality is that the pork and the poultry industries are totally underpinned with grains, and I don't believe could operate without grains. But is making a very strong point about looking at how we can reduce our meat production using grains and making the most of pasture-fed. The other good reason for doing it is that in 2016, the PFLA did a study which compared our farmers with conventional farmers. We looked at benchmarking on the business case for rearing ruminants, and our farms came out as extremely good and resilient. Just earlier this year, or maybe at the end of last year, the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology had just completed a 3-year research project on PFLA farms called Sustainable Economic and Ecological Grazing Systems, learning from innovative practitioners. And that also reinforced the positive economic case for rearing ruminants entirely from grass. So really, if we want a profitable farming business, and that's what we must all want as a society, we must want the landscape and the countryside to be looked after by farmers. They need to be able to make a living, and we would argue strongly that this is one way of doing it. My slide seems to, whoops, oh dear, hang on. It's gone a bit crooked, but anyway, you can see the point here. So one of the things I was talking about earlier on was nitrous oxide polluting, which is a serious problem. And it's something that needs to be mitigated. It's basically caused by the use of synthetic fertilizers. And something that we've come to understand is that the use of synthetic fertilizers really prevents the biological activity from the soils operating properly. Research from the Northwick Farm Platform, which is the oldest research station in the UK at Rothamsted, has 176 years of data on soils. It took 40,000 soil samples, and that showed that in the UK, 40% of arable land is degraded, 7% of grassland, and 6% of woodland. They have also shown that the fastest way of restoring the soil health is to put in grassland and grazing rotations into the arable rotation. And that's something that many farmers are beginning to do. So we know that every time the plough is pulled through the soil, quantities of carbon are lost into the air. But there are farmers out there working out how to produce food without resorting to the use of synthetic fertilizers or ploughing. And many are doing this by introducing grazing livestock back into their rotations in order to achieve it. It's this type of regenerative farming that we need to be encouraging, not the one-dimensional view that comes across during Veganuary. What matters is how we're producing our food and not what we're eating or producing. So I love this photograph. It came from one of our members when I asked for the photograph, and it shows cattle grazing a cover crop across arable land. They're building the soil and fertility as they go, moving the growing of the subsequent crop to an organic and synthetic fertilizer-free method of production. For me, what is important is all that goes with the grazing cattle and what they're doing to rebuild our soils and so help to combat climate change. When they reach the end of their lives, they then also provide us with essential nutrients not available in pulses or vegetables, such as omega-3s, leather and skins. This particular farmer has moved his production methods to such a degree by using cattle across his arable land that he has sold a tractor. It's no longer needed. The cattle are doing the job instead. So there's lots of positive things that are happening, and although there's also lots of depressing things going on out there, I think one of the things that we're encouraged by at the PFLA is the understanding, is that there is an increase in the understanding about the role that ruminant livestock have to play in the fight for climate change. So we ended 2021 with Lord Devon, who's chairman of the Committee on Climate Change, saying farmed animals are crucial in tackling climate change. He went on to say it's because grass-grazed livestock improve the ability of soil to store carbon. He called for the UK to embrace a more mixed and regenerative approach to farming, in which livestock are kept outside all year round alongside a crop rotation. It was pleasing also to see that in June 2021, DEFRA in their agricultural transition update also stated the need for a return to mixed farming as the best way to restore soils degraded by continuous cropping. So of course, if we have mixed farming, we need to be able to make the most of the products that are involved in that, and that does mean eating the meat that comes out at the end of it. So now I want to move on to talk about why 100% pasture-fed meat and dairy is the way forward for everybody, and to tell you more about some of the great things that are going on in farms and the things that farming contributes to in terms of biodiversity, carbon capture, flood prevention, clean air. These are all things that are not measured or shown in any of the data, yet they're incredibly valuable. So this photograph for me tells you a lot. This is actually me in amongst our some of our steers who are probably due to go off the market at the end of this summer. If you look at the picture, you can see that they're grazing diverse pastures, and the seed heads that you can see in there are from red clover. There are also vetches and trefoils poking their heads out. All of these species naturally fix nitrogen into the soil, so we have no need to use synthetic nitrogen fertilizers in our farm. We first stopped using artificial nitrogen in 2000 when we converted to organic, and under the standards we could no longer use it. At that time, many of our fields were predominantly ryegrass and white clover, and probably had only up to 8 species per square metre in them. The ryegrass responds really well to the nitrogen. It pushes out all the other plants that are lying dormant in the seedbed. But take off the nitrogen and the ryegrass starts to feel unhappy and declines, leaving space for the natural seedbed to come through. We encouraged clover production by rolling the fields in the spring and keeping them cropped quite closely at that time. For the first 3 to 4 years, our grassland production took a hit. From easily making 100 bales of hay per acre in June, it fell to as low as 70. But as the natural seedbed started to have its head, a range of new grasses came through, giving a long season through different varieties, and the trefoils, clovers and vetches and other native wildflowers started to show too, so that by 4 years, we were back up to 100 bales an acre. But it takes longer to get there, so our hay, rather than being ready in June, is ready in July. Research has shown that many wild grass species outperform perennial ryegrass in an organic system of management. But the upside is enormous. Our fields are awash with insects as we let the grasses and flowers go to seed. Our cattle have a varied and natural diet, and we're starting to restore some of the 97% of species-rich meadows that have been lost to intensive agriculture since the 1950s. This is a picture of one of our my favourite hay meadows, which has probably more like 40 species per acre in it. And that's what we make into hay, and our cattle are eating that and moving that seed around the farm. Just going back to this, I want you to notice all of our beautiful, healthy and joined up hedges. Over the 37 years we've been here, we've planted hundreds of metres of hedges so that all of our little woodland shores are now joined up to each other, and the rare dormice that live in these shores can travel between them in our hedgerow corridors. Farmers throughout the country are carrying out such projects, so there will be farmers grazing wood pasture in the north of England also to protect the dormouse. None of these benefits are measured in any climate-related data, yet we all know that biodiversity is a proxy for good climate action. All this good stuff goes totally unrecognised in the data. This set of slides tells the story of one of our PFLA members who farms on a floodplain. The way he grazes his cattle means he has a meadow filled with fritillaries and other rare wildflowers during the summer. His deep rooting grasses are grazed by the cattle. They're flooded each year. They hold back the water, and as you can see from the photo on the left, they get quantities of silt and lost soil dumped on them from maize fields further upstream, which are losing soil at a huge rate in the floods. Professor Michael Lee from Rothamsted did a study which showed that as much as 8.6 kilos per hectare can be lost in soil in as little as 20 hours during times of heavy rainfall. And the only way you can stop this is to have permanent grassland. So how much better for all of those fields further up not to be growing crops, but to be put down to permanent grassland? They'd be adding to flood prevention, helping to hold back the water. One of the issues on floodplains at the moment is that the remaining floodplain meadows are so disparate that they can't function properly, but put all of those back into decent floodplains and we could really do something on flood prevention. Grazing cattle and sheep are an essential cog in their health and survival of these special habitats, which are freshwater habitats, basically. I put in this series of photographs. There's one on the bottom right of Bill's cattle grazing up on a special area near where he lives. And the rest come from Hilltop Farm Girl, which are a couple who farm in Malham on the Yorkshire Dales. And this is an example of how farmers are moving their animals around in order to enhance biodiversity. So these cattle will be taken off, for instance, on the top right-hand corner there, Hilltop Farm Girl, they take off their cattle on this particular area in the early spring because the bluebells come through. In late summer, they'll be taking them off the meadows in the bottom two pictures because that's when that series of flowers can come through. So this careful management by farmers who've had centuries of experience of managing their animals around special habitats needs to be really valued, and we would not have any of those beautiful meadows if we didn't have grazing animals. This is another photograph from a PFLA member. His cattle are in a 75-acre arable field. There's very little diversity there. You can see a bare hedge that's basically dividing this from yet another 75-acre field. His animals are now being put back onto this rotation specifically to graze hay, to trample it into the soil, to wee and poo on it, and to try and rebuild the soils in that arable field and to get the biological activity going again. It could be that over time, as this happens, there's encouragement and incentives to rebuild that hedge, to replant it, make it bigger. Animals love to have good hedges. This is a very, very poor view as far as diversity is concerned, and it's as a direct result of arable farming with years and years of no cattle and plenty of chemical input to keep it going. So this brings me on now to just talk briefly about some of the nutritional benefits. You could do a whole talk on this, and it's certainly not my level of expertise, but on the right-hand side of this slide is my favourite piece of research that I absolutely love that came out probably 18 months ago now. It was carried out by Newcastle University, and they basically tested the nutritional density across 4 different meats. Conservation grazed, so very diverse pastures, pasture-fed, no cereals at all, and probably pretty diverse pastures. And then they had some supermarket organic, which you don't actually know from that label whether it's got cereals in it or not, but possibly not, and supermarket non-organic meat, which probably would have been finished on cereals. One of the issues about our diets in this day and age is a healthy diet really should have a ratio of omega-3 fatty acids to omega-6 on a balance of about 1 to 4. But because we eat so many carbohydrates and our diet as such, most people's omega-3 to omega-6 balances are more like 1 to 16. Not so healthy, as the omega-3 fatty acids are crucial to battling physical and mental ill health. So the wonderful thing about this research was that these fatty acids showed how the diet of the ruminant animal affects the nutrient quality of the meat they produce. And milk from a conventional dairy cow is roughly 1 to 4. From a pasture-fed animal is as high as 1 to 1, which is absolutely amazing. The meat from the non-organic sample was 1 to 7, and from conservation and pasture-fed was as high as 1 to 2. And one of the most exciting things about this is that under EU law, with omega-3 levels that high, you can actually put a claim on your label to say it is considered a source of long-chain omega-3 fatty acids, which is brilliant in itself. More research needs to be done in order to do a bigger sample and to really verify this and to make sure that it is always happening, because obviously at different times of the year, animals will be eating a different range of species. So there's a lot of work to be done on it, but it's a very good start. I personally feel very strongly about not eating fish, as I think we're just fishing the seas to death. And wouldn't it be wonderful if we could save the fish industry by encouraging people to eat more lamb and beef that's reared on species-rich meadows that are filling the British countryside with beautiful flowers. I should have brought a drink of water. Hang on. On the bottom left here is another rather neat little piece of research that's come from the Australia's National Science Agency, which is showing they were doing a piece of research to work out how much protein a cow was eating to produce protein for humans to eat. On the grain finish sample, where these cattle were in fact grazing on grass for most of their lives, but fed on grain for the last 3 to 4 months, that showed that they contribute almost twice the human edible proteins that it consumes. The astonishing figure on the grass-fed one with no cereals was that it contributes 1,600 times the protein it consumes. So again, that's just a really interesting piece of research and shows what a great converter of protein beef animals can be on grass. And we have to admit that we as humans are omnivores. We really should be eating a bit of meat which has essential nutrients you can't find in the same way in vegetables and pulses. I'm sure that everyone here in this room is aware that one of the reasons that we have developed such amazing brains is because hundreds and thousands of years ago we discovered fire, which meant that we could cook the meat, which meant that our bodies could utilize the nutrients in that meat in a way that we couldn't have done with raw meat. And the final piece of research, and the person I want to flag up, is Professor Michael Lee, who does a lot of work at Rothamsted on sustainable livestock systems. And he warns about using statistics out of context. So for instance, he tells us all that the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, often uses a single measure of carbon production per kilo of food produced, but this was never intended to be used to compare kilograms of product against one another, because after all, a kilogram of carrot is completely different to a kilogram of beef if the nutrients that are provided. So if you take a nutrient metric alongside beef and chicken and look at the land, beef is actually much more sustainable than chicken. So these extrapolations are extremely dangerous. Another study he did looking at how the average adult male who should consume about 60 grams of protein a day could get that protein. That person could choose to either derive it all from plants or from livestock, or a sensible combination of the two. And he's shown how a fully vegan diet would use land less efficiently than an omnivorous diet that includes livestock. And that is because livestock can utilize byproducts and land not suitable for growing crops. So there's some very good nutritional reasons for eating meat, but particularly for eating ruminant meat that's been grazed entirely from pasture. So I'm really shocked at myself about not having really looked very much under the soil in all the years that we've been here. I don't think I'm actually alone, and there's many others who are doing it. And actually, this is really exciting that we've all come to recognise that the answer to everything and the thread that runs through all of this lies in the soil. All of our problems in life, health, humanity, biodiversity, climate change, the answer is all there in the soil. And this photograph here is just showing you a comparison. So on the right-hand side is really healthy, carbon-rich soil that's under a piece of permanent pasture. Those little holes in the soil and the roots and the voids are just full. They're teeming with life and activity, and it's all working to keep our planet clean. On the left-hand side is a piece of arable soil, which is dense and cold, and there's no structure to it, and it's after years and years of ploughing and chemical inputs. So there is so much that we can do to improve the left hand and make it more like the right hand. We have lots of free school visits to our farm. I love showing the children around, and they love getting close to our animals, 60 cattle, 300 plus sheep when we have lambs, endless hundreds of chickens. But what they find most exciting of all is looking under the soil and realizing that actually 95% of life on our livestock farm is underneath the soil, and that at the moment we only understand about 5% of it at this present time. So these young people, if they can become the future scientists, there is so much more to discover on what's going on in the soil. And I think that's another reason why we need to be flexible and open-minded about what the solutions are to our very severe problems that we have. This diagram here just shows you that the fungi, there's nematodes, there's bacteria, there are plant roots, all working away under the soil. And this activity is seriously damaged by the use of chemicals. The engine room in all of this regeneration is the cow. It poops out about 30 kilos of poo each day. And it's more or less, that in itself is more or less like ready-made compost and an ecosystem in its own right. A wholesome insect-free cow poo will immediately produce a home for dung beetles and dung flies, hosts of tiny invertebrates that then start the process of taking that nutrient down into the soil. Fungi quickly take over and continue to break it down. Birds will feast on the insects, and I absolutely love that at home. Every year the swallows fly all the way from Africa to feast on our insects, rear their young in our barns, and then fly all the way back to Africa. And you can literally see them following the cattle around the farm as the summer goes. The whole process is totally natural. The grass is growing with energy from the sun, the water is firing it up, the cows munching the grass and stimulating it to grow again. She might be emitting methane, but she is part of a totally natural process of life on this earth. This is one of Bill's photographs, and I don't quite know what's happened to all the. That's an incomplete photograph, but something's happened. I don't know if this means my Wi-Fi is going a bit weird. Let's try my mouse, hold on. That was a bit slow to come up. This is just Bill said I wanted a nice picture of lots of poo and flies on it, just to show you that poo on the right there would have landed, and literally those flies would have just come straight away. I love showing that when I take the children around, we go and collect dung beetles, and these photographs here are actually of dung flies and dung beetles off our farm. They've been blown up 100 times by a friend of mine, so I could show the children what they look like, because when you actually collect them on the poo, they're tiny, some of them the size of pinheads. But if you look at these extraordinary creatures, the flies are beautiful with amazing huge eyes, hairs all over them. And then that top right hand picture, I just love it. Like its claws are like a lobster's claws. So literally when the dungs arrive, they fly into the dung, they dig their way through, they dig down into the soil, they make little holes, little channels to lay their eggs, and the process continues. So these insects are just essential to regenerating our soils, and in order for them to be there, we need a lot of poo. I'm really pleased, it's really encouraging to see that the UN now soil is right up there at the top of everybody's minds. Both of these infographics come from the UN. On the right hand side, you can see the myriad of values and uses that soil is put to in human life. But on the left hand side, even more important, is this recognition about how important the soil is, and that temperate grasslands, which includes the grasslands in the UK, you can see have potentially massive reserves of carbon. That's really exciting and shows that we can make a difference really quickly. You can start grazing in a way that means that we're taking carbon into the soil and keeping it there. That's something we as farmers need to be supported, changing how we look after our animals in order to help to make this happen. So this wetlands figure, which is so high, of course includes peatlands in the UK, but that just shows the potential. And as I've said before, we need to understand really what's going on and how it works. But the understanding is coming, and we just have to keep working at it. I put this photograph in just to quickly explain to you all a little bit more, after I'm a farmer, about what this means for us to change. So those are our Hereford cattle at home. Traditionally, we would have set stocked our cattle. That means, and our sheep, that means that we would have gone into a field of grass, and we'd assess how much grass in there, and we'd piled in the cows, and they'd be in there for several weeks or maybe months. We wouldn't be thinking about moving them very much. We're now learning that that's not the best way to graze at all. And if you want to start building your soils again and restoring biodiversity, it's far better to move your cattle very regularly and rest your fields, rest the soils that are under them. So what we're now encouraged to do is with electric fencing, and this little thin wire that you can see on the left is literally a very light poly wire which you run across the field. It's tied onto electricity, and we keep the cows in paddocks, maybe paddocks that we try and move them every day. So I work out how much I think the cows need to go in per day. I've set up the paddock, they go in, and the idea is they go into the field on the left is about 15 to 18 inches tall, the grass. They're going to go in and they're going to eat a third, the most nutritious top third. They're going to wee and trample and poo on another third, which is going to set off biological activity. And the third is for the sun to do its magic and photosynthesize it. So it's powered, the grass is powered by the sun and not by its roots. There's an understanding that once a piece of grass has been nibbled, it wants to try and grow again after 4 days. So if you keep your cattle in there for more than 4 days and nibble it twice, you're basically overgrazing it. But if you can move them out, it can start to grow again. And if you've left enough length, it'll grow with a good lot of photosynthesis, and the roots continue to go on down into the soil and not shorten. So many farmers are doing different ways of this, and some farmers have been doing this big time and might move their cattle 3 or 4 times a day, really densely, packing them in, pressing on the soil, pressing in the poo and the wee and the trampled grass and moving them on. And there are farms in Kent who have transformed their soils in 10 years by doing this. It's absolutely extraordinary. We're miles behind them. So these are things that farmers need to get their head around, new ways of farming, to actually go out on foot and pull electric fence across the field. I mean, a lot of farmers will say, my God, how can you spend your time doing it? My response would be, I spend my time doing it because it means I can keep my cattle out for longer. I'm not putting fertilizer on my soils because grass grows grass. It's a win-win situation, but I'm using my time very, very differently. So these are things that we all need to encourage farmers to do, and it's something that the PFLA is just brilliant about, supporting each other over doing these sorts of things. I wouldn't have done this if I hadn't been a member of the PFLA. So I want to leave this section now with this image and a great quote from somebody called Peter Melchett, who was former executive director of Greenpeace, and he was policy director of the Soil Association. He was also a farmer in Norfolk, and his quote, which I can't really see because my screen share thing, was something like, "I may be a vegetarian, but I couldn't farm my farm in Norfolk without livestock." So on the left here, we have soil rich in carbon under grazed pasture, and on the right, we have soil low in carbon and the arable. And that is our challenge, to produce food for vegans, vegetarians, and meat eaters. But in doing that, we have got to be using cattle in order to do really healthy and effective regenerative food production. So my last little bit I'm coming on to is to tell you all about our labelling campaign. It started off with these two images, really. On the left, we've got, it's Hilltop Farm Girl on Twitter. They have belted Galloways, which they run across the Yorkshire Dales. Those animals are out all year round. Here they are coming down for a drink in a stream, back off grazing. On the right-hand side, we can't have a bigger contrast, but those are beef finished in beef lots, probably in the United States. And what has frustrated us at the PFLA enormously is under the current labelling system, both beef from both of those two products could be labelled grass-fed. And that is quite simply because you're allowed to use the term grass-fed in the UK if it's been predominantly fed on grass. That means just 51% of their lives. The cattle on the right will probably have been brought up on grass as calves and put into these lots when they're ready, coming up for finishing. So when they're more than gone through half their lives. So we've been asking the government for ages to rectify this and to put in a proper definition of grass-fed. During the passage of the Agricultural Bill in 2020, they said that they would consult and review their labelling regulations. So we've taken this as an opportunity to work together on the wider labelling issue, because it's not just grass-fed. Let's face it, most people are confused by most labels in the retail businesses, and it really should change. So we set up a consortium, and CLEAR actually stands for the Consortium on Labelling for the Environment, Animal Welfare and Regenerative Farming. We were really amazed by the response, and within a very short time, we've got 40 organisations on board. We produced a manifesto, which you've all come behind, and basically that manifesto is calling on the government to make sure that there is a mandatory system of labelling food at all points of sale. Wherever you buy it, however it's produced, there should be a label that tells you its method of production. And its method of production means it covers a whole range of issues, not just animal welfare, not just environment, not just carbon, but it combines all of that together. We believe that this is perfectly possible now to achieve this. It actually might not have been 5 or 6 years ago, but the data systems are now in place. And we as farmers and producers are going to increasingly be asked to provide data on how we produce our animals. Those of us who already signed up to the Soil Association or Red Tractor or any of those other labels, we already have to provide a massive amount of information on all of our farming activities. So all that needs to happen is for that information to be fed through a data system and for a label to come out at the other end. So we're fighting hard to get the government to accept the principle that this should be mandatory. It should be holistic, data-driven, starting at the farms and working right through the processing system. And it should be very flexible because farming is changing such a lot at the moment. It should be a system that allows for new understanding, new ways of doing things, maybe bringing in new areas that we want to be reflected in a label. The government is rather set on voluntary labelling, but we'd argue that without this, the poorest labels, the poorest products remain unlabelled, and that means the poorest consumers aren't given choice, and confusion continues as there's a proliferation of voluntary labels. So in summary, the taking the method of production approach is basically engaging consumers directly with farmers, and it should reflect all of the things that we care about: biodiversity, carbon sequestration, the nutritional value of the food, its landscape value, livelihoods, packaging. Everything is connected to the method of production, and animal welfare is one outcome of this. So that's really what we want for production, and I think that if we can achieve that and link farmers round to consumers and start to get people to really understand what goes into their food production, that we might get a more nuanced and better understanding of the discussion that should take place in January. So just to sum up, I've gone back to a slide that I put in earlier on, because for me it says so much about people coming together and working out things in collaboration. We should all be seeking out food that's going to support the regeneration of the soils, biodiversity, animal welfare, climate stability, and human health. And that is where the regeneration of the planet needs to begin. Restoration of biodiversity, prevention of water pollution and flooding, and most important, the production of nutrient-dense food available to all citizens, whoever they are, wherever they are. Ultimately, it should be a health revolution too. I firmly believe that when people understand what goes into their food, they value that knowledge. And I say that we have lots of open days at the farm. We do free school visits, and I'm amazed at how interested people are in how their food is produced and how little they know. And it's not surprising given the way we all live these days. So I really believe that when people understand what goes into food, they value that knowledge. And my vision is that the best vegetables will be grown on the back of livestock production as part of the rotation. The best meat will come from animals that are grazing to regenerate the soils. And that is what we should all be aiming for. Constantly lumping all meat together and making simple binary opposition statements doesn't really help. Let's start to help to understand the nuances and complexities that go into our food and farming systems and work together to mend what is currently a somewhat broken system. Thank you all for your patience and listening to me. That's the end of my talk.
Thank you so much, Fidelity. That was fantastic. It was absolutely wonderful and quite arresting. Bill, can I ask you to put your camera on? And we have got some, Bill hasn't put his camera on, but never mind. We have had some questions already, Fidelity, and I'm going to group a few of them together, Isabel, because
Yep, hiya.
Hi, Bill, welcome. Several people have asked a version of this question, and I think it is the most, in a way, the most pressing question. I mean, for me personally, what you say about restoring biodiversity is really, really powerful. I think one thing should be read into the record, which I'll put into the record, which is that a lot of people are not, veganism is not just about climate. Before we thought about climate, it was what's called euphemistically an animal welfare issue, and that people think that we should not be killing intelligent, sentient creatures in order to maintain our livestock. I just feel I should read that into the record on behalf of vegans who aren't just vegans for January. But the question that people have put into the questions quite a lot is the question of cost. So I would like to ask you, if all the land that was appropriate for the way you farm livestock was used to farm livestock, and we produced that, I mean, is there a calculation for how much that would produce? I mean, I suspect not, because it's a bit of a piece of string question, but let's make that assumption. How would you distribute it? Because surely it would be very expensive.
So I would say that the answer is I don't know the figures, but if you think of putting livestock back onto all of the arable land, so we're talking about a huge amount of land that really could benefit from livestock. We're talking about a big acreage that could be put back to livestock that's not currently used for livestock. The Food and Farming and Countryside Commission are doing a land use study at the moment, and Bill might know this figure better than me, but I think I have read that their view is that use of land would change so that we would see a reduction in pork and pig intensive pork and pig production by 50%, and the ruminant livestock numbers would actually stay the same across the UK, but they'd be spread across the arable lands and everything else. So those are the best figures that I know about that. On the cost side of things, I mean, one of the things is that one of the reasons why rearing your ruminants in this way is cost effective, and why we as a group of farmers compare very favourably against other methods of raising animals is quite simply, although we might be producing less, our input costs are so incredibly reduced that our profit in the middle is bigger. So we are producing, we're making our businesses more profitable by farming in this way. Some of our members would go as far as saying, well, that means we don't have to charge very much for our meat. But then there are others of us who'd say, actually, meat just isn't expensive enough anyway, because it doesn't really reflect all the time and effort that goes into producing it. So I think there's a question about how expensive meat should be, and that could also be tied in with the issue about how often should you eat meat. I mean, we actually at home eat meat probably once a week. We often eat we have vegetarian meals, and we'll only eat meat when we've got friends around or family come or something. I asked a question at one of our PFLA events about how often people ate meat, and most people eat meat twice a day. You know, which is, they might have a piece of ham in the sandwich or chicken or something. There's a huge amount of meat eating that goes on. But I would argue that we do need to reduce the overall amount of meat we eat, but we need to make sure that we're eating meat from systems that are regeneratively reared and sustainable. And that might end up having to cost you a bit more, but you're basically spending less money overall because you're buying less meat. Bill, have you got a view on that?
Yes, I was going to say, Bill, come in.
Thanks. I have got a view, and it's a fairly complicated one, but it's historic as well, because back in the 1970s, statistics show that the average household was spending about a third of its income on food, which is at least 3 times more than households have to spend on food these days. And yet back in those days, I can't remember any mention of food banks or well, there were so many aspects of life back then that seemed to work much better, and yet people were spending more of their income on food. And you just have to ask yourself, why have things got so distorted now, where farmers are unable to sustain healthy, viable businesses at a level and a scale which promotes local food chains? So the whole thing is sort of, in the last 50 years, seems to have taken a bit of a blind alley in terms of the way that we're producing and consuming food. And the other aspect is that we just look at the price of these things that we pay in the shops. And of course, that is not the full story at all. There are all these hidden costs that we are paying as citizens, as taxpayers, in clearing up the harm that is done in producing food in ways that allow it to be sold at these cut prices.
In fact, that's a really interesting point, Bill. Bill, there's a figure on that, which is the Sustainable Food Trust did a report on that, which said that for every £1 we spend on food, society spends another £1 on clearing up the mess left behind.
So that's a measure of how complicated the whole question of the economics is.
Can I just put another question in, because we haven't got a great deal of time left. Helen Brewood has made the point that she says the regenerative grazing and vegan movements both tend to reject grain-fed livestock production. That is to say, both of these movements reject. So what other issues do you think the two movements would agree on, rather than disagreeing?
Yeah, well, I personally, you know, we sell a huge number of our customers who buy meat from the farm have got vegetarians or vegans in their families, and so we have a huge amount unifying us. And I think that's that is the shame. That is the shame about. I'm absolutely sure that a lot of vegans are perfectly sympathetic to farmers and to beef farmers, but there is a very vociferous side of vegans that tend to come out in Veganuary, which frankly is vilifying towards farmers, and that doesn't make anybody feel very good about what they're doing, or cooperative or collaborative. So I think there's a massive amount that vegans and pasture-fed farmers actually have in common. We all want to see a better planet. We want to see better animal welfare. I think maybe less strident views help come together better.
I guess my main concern over the whole vegan concept then is that without livestock, then really the only method you have for sustaining food production is with chemicals, particularly artificial nitrogen. And if we insist that that's the way we're going to produce food, then I think the whole thing is doomed in the end, because we know that eventually. So I was really shocked to hear David Attenborough, see him recommending that, you know, we could go down this route in order to save wildlife, that we should intensify our food production and use all the benefits of technology and chemistry to grow it in ways which bear no resemblance to what I would regard as proper food. And there's increasing evidence to show that if we insist on doing it that way, we will eventually harm ourselves. We're already doing this, that there are so many chemicals in the food that we eat, along with the microplastics, and that, you know, the nutrient density of it is being reduced as well. That, you know, we really have to get away from this idea that we can just have chemical factories to produce food. We have to go back to the old ways of doing it in harmony with nature.
That leads slightly on to a question that someone's asked for Fidelity, or for both of you. What do you think of the rewilding movement? Let me ask Fidelity, go back to Fidelity. What do you think of rewilding, Fidelity? How does that?
I feel there is a place for rewilding, and there's some really exciting rewilding projects going on. I feel if large landowners want to do that, then it's probably a great thing to do. And you know, the business about, so I personally think there's a place for that. But there's a much bigger place for farmers like us who are producing food and trying to do it in a way that's as friendly as possible to nature. So I think there has to be a mix of the two, and the one that's, and those of us who are producing food in this way should predominate over the rewilding. But I think the reality is that the country has become so dissected with transport and frankly intensive agricultural that we probably do need some bigger areas now to help to try and kickstart getting some of the wildlife back in place. So I personally feel there's a place for both.
Can I stick a question in for Bill? This is a bit unfair, but if I were to give you like just half a minute, Bill, what do you think of the 3-compartment model that was floated in the National Food Strategy?
I was interested in it, but I couldn't quite see how it would solve this problem of basically leaving that division, that dividing up of the land to the market. And I think that's, you know, as long as we are content to leave these solutions to market forces, having seen how much damage that's done to get us to where we are today, then I think that's very dangerous and rather daft as well. You know, if we were to take stock of all the lessons that one would have hoped we would have learnt by now. So we need some. So it's a national food strategy, and I think it should have gone one step further to start thinking about how we can incorporate the suggestions, the plans that it might develop into a more structured and schematic way that would allow us to produce a really robust and viable food system for the future.
I'm going to, we've only got 5 minutes left. I'm going to ask a question from Cicely, which I have, it's quite a long question. Fidelity, let me put it to you first. She says, one of the issues with convincing larger procurers, catering procurers, restaurants, supermarkets, etc., is the lack of metrics to quantify the farm level benefits of pasture fed, especially carbon, which is a great concern for them to include in their own ESG reporting. So, for corporate enterprises, they need to be able to demonstrate and report what they're doing. She says, do you collect data? And if so, how can we encourage more farmers to collect this data in order to help businesses understand the value of higher welfare meat? And she says the global farm metric looks promising. I think that's the Sustainable Food Trust project. Yeah. What are your thoughts on this?
So I think definitely, and I think that's what's behind our labelling thing as well, which is that we're increasingly as farmers being asked to collect data, and we should be collecting data. Be interesting to do that across the whole range of aspects that go into food production. So I mean, I, for instance, would be perfectly happy to present some data which show how many hedgerows, how many square meters of hedgerow I've got, say, in comparison to my fields. How do I graze my animals? Do I rest fields or not? So I'd be prepared to go into quite some detail if I know that it's all going into a label. That means that the consumer is better informed, and so all the businesses that are buying food should have that access to that information. One of our members for CLEAR is the Sustainable Restaurant Association, and they are saying that their chefs and people, they don't know what they're buying, and they would like to know more about what goes into their food. There was a survey done at Cambridge University of, I think, 80,000 people were asked about food labelling, and they put food labels on food, and although it didn't change what people bought, what the biggest change was that it engendered discussion in the kitchens about people saying, I never knew that was what went into this particular product. I'm going to change using it. So, I really think giving people that information is absolutely crucial and would help with business, and everything. It could kickstart us all having a much better food system.
Okay, and here's another skipping subject here, but this is really interesting. Amber Laws Johnson says, what about the new Environmental Land Management Scheme, ELMS, the scheme that's coming in to replace the Common Agricultural Scheme? Where do you see this impacting the livestock sector in terms of land use change? Do you think it'll be positive or negative? Elms?
So I think the jury's out on that at the moment. It's not entirely clear what they are planning for the livestock sector. And I mean, we at the PFLA would really love them just to recognise that farmers who certify for Pasture for Life standards should be passported quickly onto an ELM scheme, because the benefits, the wider benefits of farming in this way are so huge in terms of biodiversity and all the gains, that would be such a simple thing for them to do, but they haven't said they will do that. So I think the ELM things, unless Bill knows something more than I do, it's still not clear exactly who's going to be rewarded for what. But one thing I say about tying it back to labelling is exactly that sort of scheme, but a very simple way of getting farmers information into this labelling system is that if you're on ELMS, then you get a position on the metrics that would mean that you're earning points towards, about how good your final food product is aimed at. Bill, do you have any more views, or do you have any views on ELMS?
Yes, lots really, but we haven't got time for them all. I guess my main concern is that we're going to end up with a system that makes it difficult for farmers like me who are really farming landscapes rather than specific types of land use. So the usual conflict is between trees and pasture, and from what I've seen so far, that's they haven't got that sorted out. That if you want to include trees with your livestock as what I would call wood pasture and some would call silver pastoral system, then that's going to cause difficulties because it doesn't easily fit into the rather reductionist mindset that is still evident in some of the DEFRA thinking. But the good thing about it is that DEFRA are keen to talk to farmers. They've described the whole process as one of co-design. And so there are lots of opportunities for farmers like me with these kind of opinions to feed in to the process of designing the system. And hopefully by the time it comes out in 2004, we'll have something that is much more nuance friendly.
2024, you're 2 decades out there. 2024, not 2000.
Sorry, yes, I get lost in the historical stuff.
Very regrettably, I'm going to have to draw things to a close now. There are lots of questions, very interesting points made in the Q&A, which we haven't had a chance to touch on. I don't know, Bill and Fidelity, I think you can see them. I would like to thank you again, both, really sincerely for a really, really interesting evening, a really interesting presentation, and thank you, Bill, for your contribution. I should thank Elaine Hudson and the events team at City for making this all happen. It's gone very smoothly. And I'd like to thank all the audience who joined, particularly people who've asked questions. Again, I'm sorry that we didn't get to them. We hope you've enjoyed it. We hope you'll join us again next time. Thank you and good night.
Thank you very much, everybody. Good,
Yeah,
really,
goodbye,
really good discussion. Thanks. Bye.